tonight we're going to be speaking about a current U.S. partnership, a current U.S. relationship in the Middle East, that with the United Arab Emirates, which is customarily seen as little Sparta, as a stabilizing force in the region, particularly one that has a common enemy with the United States in Iran and terrorism. And it has a lot of friends in Washington. But there have also been a lot of Emirati interventions in its neighborhood in recent years, including in places like Yemen and Libya, most famously, but also alignment with coups in places like Egypt, Tunisia, and Sudan, growing commentary on human rights, and possible attempts to influence the outcome of U.S. elections. Our guest tonight is Jon Hoffman, who is a political science Ph.D. candidate at George Mason University, where he focuses on Middle East politics. He has an MA in Middle East and Islamic Studies and a BA in Global Affairs, both from Mason. He's been published in a number of academic and policy-oriented platforms, including Middle East Policy, the Digest of Middle East Studies, Foreign Policy, and more. And the genesis for this event was an article that Jon wrote in Foreign Policy last November, arguing that it is time for the United States to cease providing a blank check to the UAE. So, Jon, in your article, you wrote that, quote, awash with advanced U.S. weapons, the UAE has emerged as one of the region's most interventionist states, pursuing policies that have prolonged the region's civil wars, created humanitarian crises, crushed democratic aspirations, and fueled the underlying grievances that lead to unrest, end quote. Yet the United States, as I mentioned earlier, sees the UAE as a force for stability in the region. And you argue that this is part of a broader myth of authoritarian stability that has underpinned U.S. foreign policy in the region. So what do you mean by all
that? Thank you, Jon, and thank you to the Society for having me on to speak tonight. So what I mean by this myth of authoritarian stability that has guided U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for decades, really, is the idea that autocrats can best protect U.S. interests, whatever that means. It's very debated what our interests in the Middle East are, but that they can best protect our interests in the Middle East by imposing a shared political, economic, and military agenda on the region while sidelining the concerns or the interests of the masses. Of course, in this article and others, other places, I and a lot of other people have argued that this approach is not only flawed, but very paradoxical, because we would argue that these autocratic rulers themselves are the root of instability in the region, both because of the nature of their rule and because of the policies that they pursue. It is really this lack of accountability which allows them to act with impunity, both at home and abroad, that people such as myself see as really the greatest divide in the Middle East. So many times people talk about, a Sunni Shia divide or, East and West divide. People such as myself would argue that the greatest divide in the Middle East is between those autocratic rulers and the masses under which they're subjugated.
Sure. And so, and by the way, folks, we've got the Q&A feature running tonight. So if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. You can also see other people's questions, upvote them, comment on them, etc. I'll be keeping a close eye on those tonight, although I've got a few more questions of my own. So one thing that kind of immediately occurred to me as I was reading your article is that there are multiple directions, multiple policy directions that you can take a view that authoritarianism and authoritarian states are an important source of instability. One direction is to say, okay, we need to really factor that into our calculations in foreign policy, and possibly not partner with states like that. The other is that we should make the spread of democracy a goal of our foreign policy and something that we actively promote. And of course, most famously, one of the forms that this took was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which seems to have turned out rather badly in retrospect. So how do you think through those kinds of questions about, what do we do if authoritarian states are a source of instability because of the nature of their regimes?
Yeah, exactly. So I would say yes to not partnering with authoritarians, but no to spreading democracy via regime change like Iraq in 2003. What I would argue is that the best approach for the United States would be to end weapon sales and military aid to these countries. And end our overly militarized approach to the region and thereby lead with diplomacy, but also to engage with civil society actors on the ground, pushing for reforms and things like that. Much of the military aid that we actually send to the region actually violates existing U.S. laws, both Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act and the Leahy laws, which prevent the United States from providing military aid to actors who are engaged in gross human rights abuses. The United States cannot control what every government does, obviously, but what we can do is we can end U.S. complicity in the atrocities committed by these governments and reckless adventurism abroad. This, of course, is not just the UAE, but countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I would say ending military aid to Israel is imperative. So this is a much broader scope than just the UAE.
Sure. And so, one of the other views that you engaged with in your article in Foreign Policy was that part of the underlying theory for why the United States should be arming and partnering with states like the UAE is that we need to deprioritize the region in our foreign policy, and would prefer, that we want to economize on the expenditure of power there, and that therefore we should transfer some of the security roles that we play in the region to local partners and hence arm them. And that this would lead the United States to have more power to spare in its conduct in, say, Asia. So how does that, do you think that there are still ways to achieve a more limited U.S. role in the region if we aren't leaning on local partner states?
Yeah, of course. And, what I would say is what needs to happen is a de-exceptionalization of the Middle East region in U.S. foreign policy. And what I mean by that is end the overly militarized approach to the region, lead with diplomacy, and recognize that the geopolitical exceptionalism of the Middle East, which has been called primarily because of oil in the region, but also the status of Israel, that these underlying imperatives for U.S. policy in the region really need to be reassessed. And I know we'll get to it later in the conversation about great power competition in the Middle East, but just as a prelude to that, I would say, this idea that if the United States draws down or, pivots elsewhere, that somebody else will fill the void. I don't really buy that. I've written a good amount about how neither Russia nor China could really fill a U.S. void in the region. And I don't want to get too far ahead because I know we'll touch on some of that later.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and go into that right now. That's folks, one of the bases of this argument, or of similar arguments for U.S. partnership with various Gulf states, is that the Middle East, it continues to be an important source of resources, and therefore is a key strategic region, that it's going to be an arena of competition with China, and that therefore we should be partnering with local states or competing with China for their allegiance. And China has been investing a lot and building a lot of influence in the area. And I mean, recently there was talk that they had some sort of arrangement. I think it was for a possible military base in the Emirates that the Emirati seem to have backed away from. I'm not so fresh on the details of that, but that's how I remember it. What do you make of this idea of fighting other great powers, whether militarily or politically, for the Middle East?
So what I would say is that off the bat, this idea of the Middle East as a, grand theater of great power competition is rather overblown. What I would prefer to do is flip the question around and ask not necessarily what does the Middle East mean for the great powers, but what does the return of great power competition mean for regional actors and their interests? And I did an article for Middle East Policy called "The Return of Great Power Competition to the Middle East: A Two-Level Game." And it essentially argues that these are not, one-way patron-client relationships. This is very much a two-level game. And the manipulation of great power politics in the Middle East is certainly, not a new development. Just look at the Cold War. But increasingly, Middle East actors are seeking to play great powers off one another, the United States, China in particular, but also Russia. So, what I argue is it's regional actors that are kind of in the driver's seat here. And what I would say is that they, seek to gain what they can from cooperation with states such as Russia and China. And in the article, I kind of talk about how it's a shared desire to uphold the authoritarian status quo in the region, access to energy markets. China is now the largest oil consumer, investor, and trade partner in the Middle East. But it's the United States that upholds this overbearing security atmosphere, or whatever you want to call it, that allows Russia and China to expand their interests in the region at a very low cost. So the actors in the Middle East, want the United States to remain deeply engaged in the region as the security guarantor. But I would say that, much of the advances that we're seeing of Russia and China in the region are actually taking place underneath this broader U.S. security umbrella that, maintains relative stability in the region for these actors to expand their interest at a very low cost without assuming really any of the costs.
Yeah, what do you think of this Chinese base decision? What do you think was behind all of that and behind the reversal?
So I think with the Chinese base in the UAE, I think the decision to both pursue that and scrap it, I think this is part of a broader, give and take here, whereby they're not pivoting, but they're playing one off the other. And they're saying, hey, if you're not willing to commit the resources, if you're not willing to write us a blank check, essentially, we can go elsewhere. And, what I just personally viewed this as was kind of a shot across the bow of the United States saying, hey, we have ties with China. They were in discussions for the military base, but I viewed this through the lens of kind of flashing a notice to the United States as, almost a do more notice, and similar with like the F-35 deals. The Emirates have pulled out of the deals. They've stated that they've pulled out of the deals. But what I would argue is that, again, this is kind of grandstanding. This is them saying, hey, you won't provide us with the F-35 without attaching too many, strings to it. We'll just go elsewhere. And I think the week before, a couple days before they made this decision, Russia was in Dubai showing off its new fighter jet. So, it's these things, I think a lot of it is visual.
Yeah, it certainly brings to mind, you mentioned that this is not new, great power competition in the region, and also local states being able to play the great powers off each other to their advantage. And Stephen McGlinchey has an old book, U.S. Arms Policies Toward the Shah's Iran, that gets into some of these dynamics and how the Shah had a decent amount of agency. The United States always had a bit of a different vision for what Iran's military should look like, that it should basically be built to prevent the Soviets from rolling in. And the Shah tended to be interested in big, shiny weapons, in building a blue water navy, in a number of things that the United States was not interested in. And even though he was aligned with the United States, he shared at the time a border with the Soviet Union and interacted with them a fair bit. And he would flirt with the Soviets, in particular when the United States wasn't giving him what he wanted. There was at least one major time where he evaluated buying some Russian fighters in lieu of American fighters. I think during a period where he was frustrated that we wouldn't give him our best fighters. I think it was the F-15 at the time that he was trying to get. And the Soviets also built a steel plant up in Iran. And this was part of that interaction. Let's go. Let's dig into that F-35 sale a bit. Are there any more details on that? Because I know there had been a bit of mobilization against it here in the United States. Among activists, kind of along the grounds you described earlier. Human rights concerns, consideration over some of these conflicts. But then ultimately, it was actually the Emiratis who appear to have backed out. What's the story there?
So yeah, exactly. Just as you described, if I had to make a prediction, I would say, despite efforts to curtail the F-35 sales, and even despite the Emiratis, having canceled acceptance, I still believe that these deals will likely happen. And I think I may not have made that assessment a couple of days ago, but I think after the recent Houthis launching the strikes against the UAE, and I think that will really push the United States and the UAE even further together. And I think viewed through that lens of rapid developments on the ground right now, I think the F-35s are just more so of a matter of when, not really a matter of if.
Do you think that they have a vision of really becoming a high-level, effective operator of the F-35? Because one of the images that we have of Gulf militaries and Gulf weapons purchases from the United States is that they are not necessarily highly effective operators of them, but that a big part of why they buy these things is to cement relationships with the United States. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's both. I think that one, you're exactly right. It is to cement relationships with the United States. But I think on the other hand, they do, use these weapons. I mean, let's look at, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, the recent bombing of the detention facility in Yemen. I don't know if you saw the picture, but they picked up a piece of shrapnel, and it had a Raytheon code on it. So they definitely use these weapons. The UAE has also launched airstrikes in places such as Libya, Yemen. So these weapons are definitely used. But I think I would agree with you there and say that these are more so to show look how close we are with the United States, more so than they're going to be used in any sort of active combat zone.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. It has multi-layered rationales for the United States and for various actors in the United States, because F-35 cost overruns have been such a major concern here. and the size of the F-35 by the United States has been in question because of that. And of course, if you make more of something, you can often get some cost improvements. And so, there are incentives, even if you don't necessarily have an F-35 plan in your district as a member of Congress to support something like this. But you mentioned, the recent strikes in Yemen, and that I think gets to one of the big points of contention that you mentioned in your article. So, just take us back a bit. What's the UAE's role in the conflict in Yemen?
Sure. So, in Yemen, the UAE, despite having the claims of withdrawal in 2019, the UAE is still very involved in Yemen, and Yemen remains. Whenever speaking about Yemen, I always feel compelled, to mention, this is one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, and the United States continues supporting the bombing of Yemen almost unabated. But Abu Dhabi continues to provide weapons to militias, and it actively supports the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, which seeks an independent South Yemen. So there's a bit of a clash there between the pro-government coalition fighting on behalf of President Hadi. The Southern Transitional Council seeks an independent South Yemen, whereas Hadi seeks to reunify the entire country. The UAE has also continued air operations in support of such forces and continues to occupy and hold tremendous influence over Yemen's strategic islands, such as Mayoun and the Socotra Archipelago. But it's also worth... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think it's worth noting, because there's been a lot of great reporting over the past couple of years, that even post this 2019 claim of withdrawal, the UAE has been accused of engaging in war crimes in Yemen, torture, the recruiting of child soldiers, direct assassination campaigns using ex-U.S. soldiers, and transferring U.S. weapons to al-Qaeda-linked fighters. So, there's still a very active UAE presence in Yemen.
Yeah, take us through a bit of that, some of those factions on the ground that they have been backing, that they are backing, where there are some of these frictions happening within the non-Houthi forces.
Yeah, so the UAE backs the Southern Transitional Council. And one thing that I wanted to mention also was they back what is referred to as the Giants Brigade. And anybody who's been following Yemen lately, pro-government forces fighting on behalf of Yemeni's President Hadi has recently seized the oil-rich province of Shabwa. And after successfully pushing out the Houthis from this province, they continue their campaign in neighboring Marib. But UAE-backed forces have played a central role here. So between the Southern Transitional Council, but also the Giants Brigade, it's estimated, I think the Giants Brigade, I've seen suggestions as high as like 15,000 fighters. Not a tremendous amount is known about this fighting force, but it's an Emirati-backed force that some reports have suggested is primarily comprised of Salafi fighters. And I think this is most interesting because, the UAE is always viewed as, viewing any form of political Islam as kind of anathema to its interests. But here's an example in South Yemen where the UAE is actually working with Salafi fighters against the Houthis. So I just viewed that as very interesting.
Yeah, it's certainly a surprising alignment, especially because one of the factions aligned with the Hadi government is their old enemy, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Exactly.
With the Islam party. So why have the Houthis been kind of escalating against the UAE lately?
Oh, well, I think it's because of these losses on the ground. If I had to pinpoint one reason. I think it's these losses on the ground, and I think it's because of the significant role that, say, the Giants Brigade has played. The Emiratis are an active party to the war in Yemen. It's honestly quite surprising that they're just, it's horrible that they're targeting the UAE, but it's honestly quite surprising that the UAE has been able to stay so separated from this conflict, for so long, because the Houthis have launched, missile attacks into Saudi Arabia for quite a while. If I had to pinpoint a reason, it would be these recent losses on the ground, especially the Shabwa province.
And you mentioned the islands and the Emirati role there. Take us through the significance of that.
Sure. So the islands, and I recently did a World Politics Review article looking at two in particular: Mayoun, which is located directly in the Bab el-Mandeb, and then the broader Socotra archipelago. I think it's 4 islands, the largest of which is also named Socotra. They play an incredibly important role here because of their strategic locations. Like I said, Mayoun is located directly in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Socotra archipelago bridges the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea. Aside from the fact that these 2 islands reside within one of the most important global maritime routes for trade, these islands are really at the crossroads of a number of not just regional competitions, but global ones as well. Regionally, the islands act as a powerful platform for power projection into the Horn of Africa, up the Red Sea into the Eastern Mediterranean, and it serves as a gateway into the Indian Ocean through the Arabian Sea. But I think what I found most interesting about these islands is this concept that an analyst, Tom Hussein, came up with called a strategic triangle. And after the Abraham Accords, his argument was that this is a broader attempt by the United States to control these critical maritime routes as it seeks to pivot away to, Asia, or I guess, also now Eastern Europe. But so his argument was, here is Israel, and then down the Persian Gulf, here's the UAE, and then the bottom of the triangle goes across to these islands, and then the last leg of it goes up the Red Sea. So this triangle also represents the place from where China gets the vast majority of its oil. It also circumvents China's military base in the Horn of Africa, and it also circumvents Russia's proposed naval base in Sudan. So the rationale kind of behind it is the United States is absolutely fine with the UAE militarizing these islands, because if tensions with China were to escalate in the Pacific, the ability to close these lanes, or to at least have influence over these shipping lanes from where China receives the majority of its oil, would be a strategic asset.
So we've got a question here from Saad Latif. And by the way, everybody, again, our Q&A function is open. Feel free to drop questions in there. He says, I believe the crux of your argument is that supporting destabilizing powers in the GCC is not only morally reprehensible, but also a policy mistake, because we are enabling bad faith actors in the region. But at the same time, the U.S. has developed a historic strategic depth in the Persian Gulf that policymakers are just unwilling to let go of, regardless of our changing priorities in the Middle East. And so he says, I'm curious to hear what you think the way out is from this conundrum. How can the United States revamp its policy toward the GCC without giving the impression of disengagement or rocking the boat too much?
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's a great question, but I think that's also correct. I think the United States is just unwilling to let go at this point. In terms of what I think the way out of this conundrum is I'm not really sure, because at the end of the day, I think this boils down to a lack of not ideas, but a lack of political will. there is a very, very powerful lobbying force in DC that seeks to keep the United States deeply engaged in this region, whether that be arms manufacturers, whether that be think tanks. So I think the more and more we can challenge this narrative. I lost the question there.
Sorry, it's in the answered tab.
Okay. I thought I exited. But I think the more we can challenge this narrative, the more that our generation gets into positions of influence and power, especially as we've grown up kind of in this post 9/11 era where we've seen a lot of, failed U.S. policies and the repercussions of those policies. So I think, how can the United States revamp its policy towards the GCC? I think it's just a job of knowledge production, of challenging these dominant narratives. And hopefully, as more like-minded people get into office and things like that, hopefully we can begin actually adjusting some of these policies, which have, I would argue, and a lot of other people would argue, have been very counterproductive.
Sure. So going back to some of these specific cases here, another place where the Emiratis have been pretty active is the post-2011 situation in Libya. What's their role there?
Yeah, so in Libya, Abu Dhabi has provided really extensive military and economic support for the Libyan National Army, led by Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. And of course, he is fighting against the UN-recognized government based in Tripoli. The UAE has carried out air strikes, drone strikes in support of Haftar, and they've provided them with a lot of weaponry, which is in violation of UN arms embargo. I remember this being one of the pieces that I'll say people took beef with in the foreign policy article, was that I didn't mention that other actors are violating this embargo. Other actors certainly are violating this embargo, whether it be Turkey, whether it be Qatar, whether it be the Emirates, whether it be Egypt. It's not just the Emiratis. But the Emiratis have also been accused of using Sudanese mercenaries to buttress Haftar's forces in Libya. This one I found most interesting. Financing the Russian Wagner Group mercenaries fighting for Haftar, and also itself engaging in alleged war crimes in Libya.
Yeah, I mean it's a very just purely from a international alignment standpoint, from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy, it's a very interesting situation because we officially support the Tripoli government, which, as you mentioned, is recognized by the United Nations. And it's also backed by Turkey, which is officially a U.S. ally, and Qatar, which is a country that hosts, like the Emirates and a number of other places, a U.S. base. On the other hand, General Haftar, who is backed by the UAE, a U.S. partner that hosts a U.S. base, is also backed by Russians, who we don't exactly get along with these days. But he himself used to live out in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and was a well-known CIA asset. And there's been a certain amount of talk of the United States switching its alignment toward Haftar during the Trump administration. I know there had been at least one kind of pro-Haftar statement, I think, from the president himself, even though, once again, the official U.S. policy continued to be support for the Tripoli government. So it's a remarkably complicated situation where, in some ways, the United States is on both sides, even though we're officially on one.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't mean to interrupt you here, John. I think one thing that'll be really interesting moving forward with Libya in particular is there have been a lot of reports recently of Haftar and Haftar's son visiting Israel, kind of talking about, and this is coming from Israeli media, talking about, the normalization of ties in exchange for military aid and assistance. So I think the more that the Israelis get involved, I think the United States is going to find itself, pulled yet again and by another actor. I think it'll be really interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that they would be seeking arms from another state is remarkable in its own right, and I think is a testament to the limits of some of these forms of influence. Because even though if you said, okay, Russia, the UAE, experienced, effective military leader in the form of Haftar, you look at that on paper and say, okay, well, those guys are definitely going to win. But actually, they've had a lot of struggles. They've had a decent amount of setbacks. And that some of the Turkish provided weapons in particular have been seen as very effective. There was a recent article saying, hey, like these Turkish provided drones have been very effective against Russian air defenses. And by the way, the Ukrainians also operate these drones and might be able to use them in the event of a Russian intervention deeper into Ukraine. So we've got another angle that you mentioned is that the Emiratis supported or aligned with several of the recent coups in the region, including Egypt and Tunisia, and apparently Sudan as well. What's the story there? Why are they doing that?
So I would say, this is because the UAE is very much a status quo power in the Middle East. Like many other states in the region, the UAE seeks to prevent the emergence of a popular democratic paradigm in the Middle East because this would challenge their own authoritarian status. But also on the more like geopolitical side, the UAE doesn't want to see competitors benefit geopolitically from the overthrow of these autocracies by their adversaries strategically exploiting these vacuums. So I think it's kind of a dual purpose. It's this desire to maintain the regional balance of power, which is in their favor, but also a desire to maintain the authoritarian status quo in the region.
And how are things going? I mean, speaking of some of these forces, in a lot of these situations, the Qataris are on the other side, and the last few years have seen a lot of friction between the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, Egyptians, among others, versus the Qataris, kind of culminating in essentially a kind of blockade or a soft blockade or siege. How has that been going? Because that's been a major headache for the United States since we were partners with both countries, and there were even rumors that Mohammed bin Salman had planned to possibly even invade Qatar at one point, and Mr. Kushner was heavily involved in trying to sort things out in that situation. How has that been developed?
Yes, I remember the reports that Saudi Arabia was going to dig a moat and make Qatar an island. But yeah, so the Gulf crisis, has officially ended. But I would say that the underlying sources of friction between these states has definitely not abated. Qatar, and Turkey, sought to cast their lot behind a different set of actors. They were primarily supportive of Islamist movements in the Middle East. This does not mean that they're supportive of, democracy movements in the Middle East. They're supportive of those who, they perceive that would best advance their interests. But you still see really intense competition despite a cooling of narratives and things like that. You see intense competition still in the Horn of Africa. You see it in the Eastern Mediterranean. You still see it in Libya. But as there's kind of this talk now about a regional rapprochement, a regional I don't want to say people getting together and singing Kumbaya, but this idea of them cooling these sources of friction and things like that. But I would say that these conflicts are more frozen than resolved. The underlying sources of grievances that led to the Arab uprisings in the first place have not been addressed, have only gotten dramatically worse. So these conflicts between these states seeking to benefit from these monumental changes in the region could easily erupt, just as you saw, the UAE and Saudi, swoop into Sudan, or, with the coup in Tunisia. It's just so rapidly developing that I would say these tensions are frozen, not resolved.
Yeah, and that gets to another element of this kind of international strategic competition between some of these Gulf actors is a question of how we should view Islamist movements in the region as political forces, particularly ones linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the critique that is advanced by the critics of the Muslim Brotherhood and similar movements is that it's not a democratic organization, that to the extent it wants democracy, it's so that they can have one person, one vote, one time, that it can be a gateway drug for further radicalization. The people will join the Brotherhood and then leave it for more radical institutions. Is that something that is, would you say that's basically an accurate view, or, should the United States share the Emirati, et cetera, concern with Muslim Brotherhood influence in the region?
So I would argue no. I would argue that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a terrorist organization, and is not this boogeyman that they've made them out to be. Now, that being said, that's not saying that I support the Muslim Brotherhood, but mainstream political Islamist movements in the Middle East have really begun a turn towards, I think it was Asif Bayat, he kind of termed it post-Islamism. Whereas, we used to see Islamist parties, staunchly adhering to the idea that Islam is the solution. Now we kind of have a post-Islamist turn by groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, whereby they advocate for, democracy, human rights, and things like that. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood is often used as a scapegoat for a lot of these governments. But I also think that if the people of the Middle East were to genuinely be able to choose and have their array of individuals to select from across the ideological spectrum, with no constraints on people who can actually, run for office or things like that, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood would fare incredibly well. In Egypt, that was a very engineered election, let's put it that way. It was essentially Mohammed Morsi, and then it was the individual who was directly associated with Mubarak. So the people, it was essentially a no vote for him more than it was an enthusiastic, we love the Ikhwan. But no, I don't share that negative perception of the Muslim Brotherhood. I understand people say, people go on, start out in the Muslim Brotherhood, but go on to do horrible things. But that I don't think is a reason to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood. People often start out in the Republican Party and then go on to do, and then leave it for, much more extreme organizations. So,
we've got a question from Brian Choquette, who asks, in what ways have the failures of the Arab Spring with respect to seeding democracy in the Middle East informed current policymakers? I think he means in their approach to the relationship with the UAE. Is this a situation where the United States might prefer to deal with non-authoritarian governments, but there simply aren't many good options in the region?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. And I think I understand what you're asking here. So are you essentially asking how has the failure of the Arab Spring just informed current policymakers' approach to the region in general?
Yeah, I think that's how I see it.
Okay.
That's how I read the question. Yes, has the United States, even if we would prefer to work with countries that politically are a bit more like us, we've seen the Arab Spring basically fail, particularly now that Tunisia had the coup. It's hard to point to cases of success there, and that therefore there are not really any nascent democratic partners in the area that we can turn to, and so we've kind of got the best partners we can find.
No, and thank you for clarifying. No, absolutely, and what I think is since 2011, we've seen the failures of the Arab uprisings, but I think we need to investigate those reasons why it actually failed, and that would be these long-standing systems of autocracy in the Middle East, these counter-revolutionary forces, and the way in which external powers outside of the Middle East, including the United States, undermined a lot of these movements for democracy. So yes, the Arab Spring has turned, I don't want to call it a failure. Yes, you've seen a lot of bad outcomes because of the hijacking of these uprisings, because of external interference and things like that. But I think what it did was it kindled within people in the region a sense that change is possible. And I think the Arab uprisings aren't finished. I think the United States should stop doubling down on these autocratic actors, which only makes the grievances that originally led to these mass mobilizations worse. And it's here where I would argue that the United States needs to shift to engage with like civil society actors and things like that. Yes, and I completely understand, the very realist approach, hey, we got to deal with what we got. But we can deal with what we have without being complicit in the actions and policies enforced by these governments. So we can stop selling them weapons. We can stop this unconditional aid. We can hold them accountable when they seek to interfere domestically in U.S. politics or when they go on these illegal hacking sprees. Yeah.
Well, and since you mentioned interference in U.S. politics, I mean, that's another thing that hasn't gotten too much attention. But take us through a bit of what you're alluding to there.
Yes. So speaking direct, do you want me to talk more about the more general influence in the United States and then get into that, like, those more like malicious?
Yeah, well, I think that actually would be good context because there's both a lot of legal influence and some allegations of efforts to illegally influence U.S. politics and policy making and policy conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to clarify, because, the U.S. being a democracy and an open society, a lot of the, maybe if you want to call them influence campaigns, a lot of this stuff is legal. So speaking of those more legal avenues, governments such as the UAE or Israel or Saudi Arabia, they fund heavily many think tanks in DC. Ben Friedman has done some really phenomenal work looking at the UAE lobby in Washington. They fund think tanks, media organizations. A couple months back did an article for Responsible Statecraft looking at the merging of the traditional quote unquote Israel lobby, and it's merging with the Arab autocracies in the Middle East. And it's really fascinating because you look at it, their lobbying efforts have really started to merge. And you have countries such as the UAE or Saudi Arabia really reaching out to groups very staunchly within the Israel lobby, many Jewish organizations, and think tanks that are traditionally within the Israel lobby, such as Foundation for Defense of Democracies and things like that. There's also a high level of personal connections here. There are individuals in the Emirati government who are very connected in DC. Same with the Saudi government, the Israel government. These individuals are very well known in DC. I don't want to say any names or anything like that, but they're very well known. Their courting activities are very well known, and that's where you get into more of this attempts to malignly interfere in U.S. domestic politics. So the two that I touched on in the article were Tom Barak and George Nader. Barak, of course, was Nader. Sorry. Nader was the one who was accused, or according to the New York Times article, he was the one who met with Donald Trump Jr. and the one who said, we want to get your father elected. We have people, in the UAE and Israel who want to get your father elected. And they were the ones who gave the idea of engaging in these social media manipulation efforts. Of course, the Mueller report goes kind of blank after that. Of course, they don't know, whether or not that was ever taken up or anything like that. But the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Qatar, Turkey, every single state in the Middle East has engaged in social media manipulation, whether it be fake accounts and troll armies and things like that. But then, of course, there's Tom Barak, who failed to register as a foreign agent, who tried to push, certain individuals to be Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and things like that to Donald Trump. Again, without declaring that he was a foreign agent, and the people that he were pushing, were perceived as sharing the interests of the Emirates. I haven't followed up on the legalities surrounding him anymore. I think George Nader was actually just, I think he was convicted of.
There was a lot of legal action. Yeah, and I mean, and speaking to the influence, Saad Latif in the comments says that that there's also a lot of funding for universities and educational initiatives. Which I could tell you, American University, for example, there's a Sharjah Plaza named after one of the Emirates. There's also the big atrium in the School of International Service is named after a Bahraini prince. I'm sure there are similar situations at some of the other universities in the area. But we've got a question from Steve Hooger, mentions the Abraham Accords. In light of the perspective of the UAE as a negative actor, how should the Accords be viewed? On the one hand, it's a positive development on the surface that you're seeing this rapprochement and official peace between Israel and several Arab states. On the other, perhaps recognizing Israel may be a cynical move by the UAE to curry favor or stay in America's good graces. What do you make of the Abraham Accords here?
So I would argue that the Abraham Accords, and this might be sound harsh, but I would argue that they have nothing to do with peace. This is a creation of a more formal coalition, as the United States seeks to offshore its interests and pivot elsewhere. But I actually think it's coming out tomorrow. I have a new article talking about how this is also a coalition that is dedicated to preserving the authoritarian status quo in the Middle East. I would argue that Israel benefits greatly from working with these Arab autocracies and views democracy in the region as something anathema to its interests. So I would say that the Abraham Accords are a way for the United States to offshore these efforts in a more formalized coalition. And of course, these states want to be part of this coalition. They want to, have the United States as their security guarantor, along with the goodies that they got, when they join the agreements. The UAE, if they do indeed get the F-35s, or Morocco got the Western Sahara, Sudan got taken off the foreign terrorism sponsor list. Did Bahrain get anything? Any immediate goodies? I don't think they did. But I would say that it needs to be viewed in that context: a desire to maintain the authoritarian status quo in the region, and a desire to be part of this more formalized coalition as the United States seeks to pivot elsewhere.
So we've got about 2 more minutes, but one of the other issues that's drawn the headlines a lot is the UAE's association with surveillance of dissidents, of others, of journalists. Take us through that.
Yeah, no, I think there was also a question in there about whether it's okay to contact me about the program at Mason. Absolutely. Should I just put my email in the chat box here, or?
Yeah, or you can announce it, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, let me put it in the. Here, I will put it here. I think I sent it.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, great. Yeah, so speaking about these surveillance softwares, so of course Israel's NSO group has sold its Pegasus software to the UAE, which has been used to surveil dissidents, political activists abroad, politicians abroad. But I think what's most interesting is there was I think it was in 2019 or 2020, there was a comprehensive investigation published by Reuters, which documents how former Western security officials and various intelligence contractors have really established a surveillance powerhouse in the Middle East. It's now controlled and directed by, I believe, Dark Matter, the Emirati firm Dark Matter, but originally led by former U.S. counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke when he was serving as a consultant for the UAE. A secret unit was initially developed and designed to assist the Emiratis in fighting terrorism electronically. However, this gradually evolved, and those targeted by this unit expanded to all of those deemed as foes by the UAE government. And this exploded post-2011. New targets grew to include women's rights activists anywhere in the Gulf. They've prominently targeted many women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. They've targeted diplomats at the United Nations, personnel at FIFA, human rights activists, journalists, political dissidents, government officials around the world, and even U.S. citizens. So I would say the UAE and a lot of these governments in the region more generally just operate some absolute surveillance powerhouses.
Yeah, and I believe some of the Americans involved in that have faced legal consequences, and as I understand it, there have been warnings sent out to members of the former members of the intelligence community about the potential legal risks of getting involved with some of these projects, and there has been ongoing legal fallout in the United States for some of these companies that are involved as well. But that is all of the time we have. Jon Hoffman of GMU has been our guest. I've dropped links in the chat to some of our upcoming events. Thank you, Jon, and thank you, everybody, for this important discussion. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jon, for the opportunity.